take a slow breath and feel the quiet settle. Many listen quietly here night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. When a city forgot how to breathe, a city that never learned to exhale, New York did not wake up one morning and decide it wanted a park. Cities rarely make decisions that way. They do not pause, stretch, look around, and say, "Perhaps we need more grass." Cities move first and reflect later, usually after something begins to ache. By the middle of the 19th century, New York was aching everywhere at once. The island was crowded in a way that felt personal. Streets were packed with bodies, carts, animals, arguments, ambitions, and a remarkable amount of manure, contributed generously by horses who had not agreed to be part of an industrial experiment. Buildings rose quickly and without much conversation between them. They leaned toward each other, narrowing the sky, pressing sound downward, keeping heat trapped close to the ground where people lived. Noise did not arrive in moments. It arrived in layers: hooves on stone, wheels on wood, shouting vendors, steam hissing, metal striking metal, factories coughing smoke into the air, as if the city itself had developed a persistent, unresolved cold. At night, the sounds softened slightly, but they never truly stopped. The city did not sleep. It merely dimmed. People lived inside this density without language for it. They were tired in ways that had not yet been named, exhausted without a diagnosis, irritated without an enemy they could point to. The idea that a place itself could wear you down had not fully formed yet, but bodies understood it long before words did. Homes were small, streets were narrow, light struggled to reach ground level. Fresh air became something you encountered accidentally, like finding a coin on the sidewalk. When it happened, you noticed. When it didn't, you carried on. Slightly heavier than the day before. New York was growing faster than its own understanding of what growth cost. Immigrants arrived daily, carrying everything they owned in bundles small enough to lift after weeks at sea. The city absorbed them without ceremony. Tenements multiplied, rooms filled, alleys narrowed, children learned the shape of brick walls before they learned the shape of trees. The concept of open space became abstract, almost philosophical. There were parks, technically, small ones, polite squares of grass, fenced off from real life, where rules were posted before comfort arrived. They were not places to rest, they were places to behave. The largest green space in the city could be crossed in minutes. Minutes were not enough. People did not yet say they needed nature. That sounded indulgent. They said they needed order. They said they needed cleanliness. They said they needed morality, productivity, efficiency. But underneath all of it was a simpler truth, quietly insisting itself into tired bones and restless minds. They needed somewhere the city stopped talking. No one stood on a corner and announced this realization dramatically. It emerged slowly, unevenly, through editorials, conversations, complaints, and the private thoughts people had while standing still in crowds that never seemed to thin. The city was successful. And success, it turned out, was loud. New York was becoming a place where everything happened at once, and nothing ever rested. That condition felt impressive for a while. Then it began to feel unbearable. And that is when the idea appeared. Not as poetry, not as romance, but as relief. The idea of a park entered the conversation not because people wanted beauty, but because they wanted space where nothing was expected of them. A place that did not demand productivity. A place that did not ask who you were, what you did, or how quickly you could move. A place where the city loosened its grip, just enough to let people breathe, without noticing they were doing it. The ridiculous proposal. Once the idea existed, it immediately sounded unreasonable. In a city that struggled to house its population, someone suggested removing land from circulation. In a place where every square foot could become profit, industry, or housing, someone proposed leaving it empty. Not temporarily, permanently. Grass, trees, winding paths that did not go anywhere useful. The suggestion was received with the kind of silence usually reserved for ideas that do not know their place. Why would you waste valuable land on leisure when people needed jobs? Why plant trees when buildings could rise instead? Why give space to rest in a city that rewarded motion? The proposal felt luxurious in a way that made people uncomfortable. It sounded like something meant for other cities. Older cities. European cities with long histories and fewer insecurities. New York was young. New York was hungry. New York did not have time to lie down in the grass. And yet the idea persisted. It survived ridicule, budget arguments, political hesitation, and the practical observation that grass does not pay taxes. It survived because it addressed something no factory, street, or tenement could fix. The city's problem was not only material, it was atmospheric. People were being compressed by their surroundings. Not dramatically, not violently, quietly, day after day, street after street. The city was very good at giving people reasons to stay and very bad at giving them reasons to pause. A park, in this context, was not an escape. It was a pressure valve. The irony, of course, was impossible to ignore. In order to create space for relief, the city would first need to exert immense force. Land would have to be claimed, ground reshaped, communities relocated, enormous labor applied to produce something that looked effortless. Nature, carefully manufactured. The park was imagined as a place that would appear timeless, even though every inch of it would be planned, measured, adjusted, corrected, and defended. Visitors would wander through it as if it had always been there, never suspecting the arguments, decisions, and erasures beneath their feet. This was the contradiction at the heart of the project. To build a space that made people forget it was built at all. It was an idea perfectly suited to a city that preferred results over explanations. The proposal gained supporters not because it made sense on paper, but because it felt right in the body. Those who had traveled elsewhere had seen what open land could do to crowded minds. They returned with comparisons that embarrassed New York just enough to sting. Other cities had places to walk without purpose. Other cities had places where rich and poor accidentally shared shade. Other cities had already learned that order was not only enforced through walls and rules, but through quiet. New York did not like being shown what it lacked, and so the idea advanced, slowly, unevenly, wrapped in arguments about improvement, civilization, and public good. It learned to speak the language of necessity rather than desire. It stopped asking to be loved and started asking to be justified. A park, its advocates argued, would make people calmer, more orderly, more manageable. This was comforting logic. It suggested that beauty could be useful, that rest could be productive, that silence could serve a purpose. The city nodded cautiously. History often begins this way, not with consensus but with reluctant agreement, not with clarity, but with the quiet realization that continuing as before might be worse than trying something untested. The park was no longer a dream. It was becoming a solution. And solutions, once accepted, rarely ask permission from the ground beneath them. Walking toward the center. By the time the decision felt inevitable, the city had already started speaking about land as if it were empty. Maps simplified reality beautifully. Lines replaced lives. Shaded areas became opportunities. The center of the island, rocky and uneven, was described as inconvenient terrain, unsuitable for development, marginal, forgettable. Words that made it easier to imagine change without consequence. From a distance, the site looked ideal, large enough to matter, central enough to impress, difficult enough that no one important would complain too loudly about losing it. On paper, it appeared as unused space waiting for improvement. On the ground, it was something else entirely. There were homes there, not grand ones, practical ones, built slowly, repaired often, shaped around daily routines rather than architectural ambition. There were gardens, animals, paths worn smooth by repetition. There were children who knew which rocks were safe to climb and which puddles stayed longest after rain. None of this translated well onto planning documents. The city began preparing itself for transformation using familiar language. Progress, improvement, public benefit, the kind of words that soften edges and quiet questions, the kind of words that allow removal to sound like reorganization. This is where the story shifts. Up until now, the park exists as an idea, a response to pressure, a dream of quiet. From this point forward, it becomes an action, something that requires decisions about who stays, who leaves, and what is allowed to remain visible once the grass grows in. The city is about to learn that creating space always involves taking it from somewhere else. What follows is not a story of villains and heroes. It is quieter than that. It is a story of systems doing what systems do best, moving forward while looking straight ahead, rarely down. As the plans solidify and the boundaries sharpen, the park begins to take shape not only as a landscape but as a choice about what the city values enough to preserve and what it is willing to forget in order to feel better. Tonight, we step closer to that center, not to judge it, not to resolve it, but to observe how something meant to offer rest was built on motion, displacement, and silence. The grass has not been planted yet. The paths do not exist. But the direction is set, and history, once pointed, rarely pauses to check who might be standing in the way. Before the park, before the pause. Before Central Park existed, Manhattan did not feel unfinished. It felt busy. And for a very long time, busy was mistaken for successful. The island stretched upward and outward with restless confidence, convinced that motion itself was proof of progress. Streets filled quickly, not only with people but with intentions. Every step had somewhere to go. Every block promised work, trade, noise, and a reason to hurry. Nothing waited, nothing lingered. Even stillness felt temporary, like something that might be corrected if left unattended. Green space in this environment was not exactly missing. It was simply irrelevant. Small parks existed, scattered like afterthoughts between buildings that mattered more. They were neat, contained, and extremely polite. Fenced squares with trimmed grass and benches placed at respectful distances, as if rest itself required supervision. You could sit there briefly, but you were expected to behave. These spaces did not invite you to relax, so much as remind you to remain upright. They were not places to forget the city. They were places to remain aware of it. Most of Manhattan had no real relationship with nature at all. Trees appeared occasionally, usually struggling, surrounded by brick and foot traffic, doing their best not to be in the way. Grass survived in fragments, more symbolic than useful. The idea that someone might lie down outdoors without a reason would have seemed strange, even suspicious. The city was practical. It admired efficiency. It respected effort. Rest did not rank highly. People moved through their days, carrying tension the way they carried tools or bags, without comment. Shoulders tightened, jaws clenched, steps quickened. Noise followed them everywhere, and after a while the noise stopped being noticed. It became background, like breathing air that was never particularly clean, but good enough to keep going. Manhattan in the mid-19th century was dense in a way that pressed inward. Buildings leaned toward each other. Streets narrowed. Light reached the ground reluctantly. The sky felt smaller than it should have, as if it had been divided into narrow strips between rooftops. Smells traveled freely. So did sound. Horses contributed generously to both. Factories added their own layers, turning the air into something that lingered on clothing and skin. People learned to accept it. Acceptance was a skill you developed quickly if you wanted to survive the city without complaint. There was no language yet for environmental stress, no diagnosis, no polite explanation. People simply felt worn down in small, cumulative ways. Sleep came, but not deeply. Thoughts raced when they should have slowed. Irritation appeared without invitation and stayed longer than expected. The city did not ask how anyone felt. It asked what they produced. Public life unfolded in tight quarters. Markets overflowed. Tenements stacked, families vertically. Alleys became playgrounds, workspaces, shortcuts, and sometimes the only place to stand still without blocking traffic. Children learned to navigate crowds before they learned to read. Adults learned to ignore discomfort because acknowledging it offered no solutions. In theory, nature existed elsewhere, outside the city, beyond the island, somewhere you went when you had time, money, or both. For most people, that meant never. Manhattan was not designed for wandering. It was designed for arrival. Streets pointed you forward. Buildings told you to enter, work, leave, repeat. There were few places where you could stop without explanation. Standing still felt like idleness. Sitting too long invited questions. Even Battery Park, the largest green space at the southern tip of the island, was small and crowded, pressed against the water like a last breath before the sea. It offered a view, not relief. You could see distance, but you could not escape density. The city believed this was normal, or at least inevitable. There was a quiet assumption that discomfort was the price of ambition, that crowded streets meant opportunity, that noise meant life, that exhaustion was a personal issue, not a structural one. If you were tired, you worked harder. If you were overwhelmed, you adapted. Cities were not expected to be gentle. This mindset produced impressive results. It also produced people who were constantly on edge without knowing why. Public discourse focused on visible problems: crime, sanitation, housing, immigration. These were discussed loudly and endlessly. The absence of quiet, however, went largely unmentioned. Silence was not considered an infrastructure need. And yet people noticed its absence in subtle ways. They lingered longer than necessary near rivers. They paused in doorways where breezes passed through. They stood still when carts stopped moving, not because they had to, but because the stillness felt briefly unfamiliar, almost pleasant. Moments like these passed quickly. The city resumed. There was no collective demand for nature. There was no organized movement for green space. What existed instead was a growing sense that the city was asking too much without offering anywhere to recover. This was not romantic dissatisfaction. It was physical. Manhattan functioned like a machine that never powered down. It expected its parts to remain active at all times. Maintenance was implied, not provided. People maintained themselves as best they could, with food, sleep, conversation, and routine. But something essential was missing, and it was missing everywhere at once. The irony was that the city did not look broken. From the outside, it appeared energetic, ambitious, unstoppable. From within, it felt tight, compressed, restless. No one stood up and declared this a crisis. It was not dramatic enough. Instead, it seeped into everyday life, into posture, mood, patience, a low-level strain that followed people home and waited for them in the morning. Green space, when mentioned at all, sounded indulgent, like a luxury reserved for those who had already solved their practical problems. Grass did not house families, trees did not generate income, parks did not feed anyone. These were arguments made confidently, often by people who had not tried living without them. The city continued forward, proud of its momentum. But beneath the confidence, something quieter was forming. A recognition that progress without pause did not feel as stable as it looked. That growth without breathing room produced impressive skylines and deeply tired inhabitants. The absence of true parks was not yet framed as a failure. It was framed as a temporary inconvenience, something that could be addressed later when there was time. Later, of course, is where cities place their most difficult questions. Manhattan before Central Park was not cruel by design. It was simply focused on building, expanding, accommodating, producing. It did not hate nature. It simply did not know where to put it. The island filled every available space with purpose, and in doing so, left no room for aimlessness, no room for wandering without direction, no room for being still without explanation. People adapted. They always do. They learn to rest while moving, to think while walking, to sleep lightly, to ignore the absence of quiet as if it were a personal weakness rather than a shared condition. The city rewarded this adaptation with survival, but survival over time began to feel insufficient. There were no protests about grass, no marches demanding trees. What existed instead was a slow shift in perception, a realization among some that the city's greatest strength was also its greatest strain, that a place built entirely around motion might eventually need somewhere to stop. Before the park, Manhattan did not lack beauty. It lacked space for softness. It lacked places where the city loosened its grip. It lacked moments where effort was unnecessary. The absence was quiet, constant, and easy to dismiss. And that is precisely why it mattered. Before anyone thought to call it a problem, the city had already taught its residents how to live without pause. People learned to rest in fragments, in seconds stolen between obligations. A moment leaning against a wall, while waiting for a cart to pass. A breath taken at a window that faced an alley wide enough to allow air to move. A brief stillness before sleep, interrupted almost immediately by sound rising through the floorboards. Rest was not a place you went. It was something you negotiated. Manhattan trained its people well. It rewarded alertness and punished hesitation. You learned quickly that standing still was a liability. Someone would bump into you. Something would roll past your feet. Noise would fill the gap you left unattended. Even thought felt rushed, as if ideas themselves needed to keep pace with the streets outside. Reflection happened later, if at all, usually when the body finally insisted. There were moments when the city's density felt almost impressive, a sense that everything you might need was within reach, that opportunity waited just beyond the next intersection. That closeness, that compression was celebrated. It was written about with admiration. A city so alive, so busy, so full of motion that it barely slept. This was framed as strength, not strain. But bodies tell different stories than editorials. Shoulders remained tense long after work ended. Tempers shortened without obvious cause. Sleep grew lighter, thinner, less restorative. People did not complain much. Complaining suggested weakness, and weakness did not age well in a city built on competition. Instead, discomfort became background noise, like the hum of carts and voices that never truly faded. The absence of green space was rarely articulated, but it was felt. It appeared as a kind of longing that had no clear object. People could not say what they missed, only that something felt perpetually unfinished. The city offered no obvious answer. It provided work, distraction, density, and reward. It did not provide release. Even leisure was structured. Taverns were loud, theaters crowded, social spaces filled quickly and demanded interaction. Silence was rare, solitude rarer still. If you wanted to be alone, you usually had to go somewhere that felt unsafe or inappropriate, neither of which encouraged relaxation. The city seemed suspicious of quiet, as if stillness might invite inefficiency. Children grew up assuming this was normal. Their idea of open space was defined by streets temporarily cleared of traffic or by rooftops that offered narrow views of sky. Play adapted accordingly. Games fit into whatever space remained. Movement was constant. Even joy happened quickly, squeezed between responsibilities. The city did not intend to exhaust its people. It simply never considered rest as a shared need. Rest was private, personal, something you managed on your own, if you were capable enough. If you struggled, that was unfortunate, but hardly the city's concern. And yet, slowly, the idea began to circulate that perhaps something structural was missing. Not housing, not jobs, something less tangible, and therefore more difficult to argue for. Space that served no immediate purpose. Land that did not justify itself through output. This was a dangerous idea, in a place that valued visible results. A park produced nothing. It generated no goods, moved no cargo, housed no tenants. On paper, it looked like a waste. On the ground, however, it represented something the city had failed to provide, a place where effort could stop without consequence. Before Central Park, Manhattan had no such place. Not truly. There was nowhere large enough, quiet enough, or neutral enough to allow the city to loosen its grip. Every space belonged to something: commerce, transit, industry, residence. Even small squares felt claimed, managed, supervised. The idea of a park challenged this logic. It suggested that emptiness could be valuable, that land could serve people simply by existing, that stillness might be as important as motion. These were not arguments that fit easily into budgets or political speeches. So, the city hesitated. It always does when confronted with something that cannot be measured easily. But hesitation does not mean dismissal. It means the question has lodged itself somewhere uncomfortable. Manhattan before the park did not yet know what it was missing, but it was beginning to sense that relentless momentum had limits, that a city, like a person, could be strong and tired at the same time. The streets kept filling, the buildings kept rising, the noise kept accumulating, and somewhere beneath all of it, an idea waited quietly, patient enough to survive ridicule, delay, and doubt. An idea that suggested the city might need to learn something radical. How to stop, how to leave space unclaimed, how to exist without demanding constant motion. That idea had not yet found its shape. It had no name that carried weight, but it was there, moving slowly through conversations and thoughts, gathering presence without announcing itself. And soon enough, it would ask the city to do something it had never done before: give up land on purpose. The dreamers and their gentle naivety. Every city eventually produces a certain kind of person, not builders, not politicians, not merchants, but observers. People who stand slightly to the side of momentum and begin to wonder whether all this movement is actually taking anyone somewhere better. New York, in the middle of the 19th century, was no exception. Amid the noise and expansion, a small group of thinkers began to suspect that the city's greatest problem was not disorder but exhaustion. And more strangely, they believed the solution might be grass. These were not radicals in the modern sense. They did not seek to overthrow systems or dismantle institutions. In fact, many of them believed deeply in order, improvement, and progress. What set them apart was the assumption that human behavior was not fixed, and that environment mattered more than people were willing to admit. Put simply, they believed that if you changed the surroundings, people might change with them. Calm streets might produce calmer citizens. Open views might soften hardened minds. Trees, of all things, might teach patience. It was an appealing idea, also slightly absurd. The notion that nature could fix people carried a faintly optimistic tone, the kind that suggests society is a little rough around the edges, but fundamentally correctable. These thinkers did not imagine a city transformed by laws or force, but by exposure. Give people space to walk without purpose, and they might become less aggressive. Give them scenery that does not shout, and perhaps they would lower their own voices. It was social reform by landscape, a strategy that relied less on discipline and more on suggestion. This belief did not emerge in isolation. Many of these dreamers had traveled. They had seen other cities doing something New York was not yet brave enough to attempt. In London, vast parks unfolded like green interruptions in the urban fabric, places where crowds dispersed instead of compressed. In Paris, long avenues opened onto landscaped spaces where leisure was not hidden or apologized for. Families strolled. Individuals lingered. The city seemed confident enough to allow people to stop moving. Returning to New York after such experiences was uncomfortable. Comparisons have a way of stripping confidence quickly. Against European capitals, New York appeared energetic, ambitious, and remarkably insecure. It built quickly but rarely paused. It expanded upward but offered little room to breathe at ground level. To visitors, this looked impressive. To those who had seen alternatives, it looked unfinished. The embarrassment was subtle, but persistent. New York liked to think of itself as modern, forward-looking, destined for greatness. And yet it lacked something cities centuries older had already mastered: restraint. Parks in Europe were not treated as indulgences. They were treated as necessities, civic infrastructure as essential as roads or bridges. This realization unsettled the city's self-image. The dreamers leaned into this discomfort. They wrote, spoke, and argued not only that New York deserved a great park, but that it needed one to be taken seriously. A city without a significant public green space, they implied, was not quite civilized. This was a clever strategy. Civic pride proved more persuasive than concern for well-being. It was easier to argue that the city looked bad than that its people felt bad. Gradually, the idea of a park shifted from sentimental to strategic. It became a symbol of maturity, a sign that New York had progressed beyond pure accumulation into something more reflective. The park was no longer just a place to rest. It was a statement, a visible declaration that the city understood itself well enough to leave space unused. Of course, this framing came with its own assumptions. Many of the dreamers believed the park would teach people how to behave. That exposure to orderly nature would encourage orderly conduct, that walking paths and open lawns would subtly instruct the working class in calmness, decorum, and restraint. This was reform wrapped in aesthetics, improvement disguised as leisure. There was something gently patronizing about it. The idea that grass could correct social tension carried an air of benevolent superiority, but it also revealed genuine concern. These thinkers were not indifferent to suffering. They simply trusted design more than politics, environment more than enforcement. They believed that if people were given a chance to slow down, they might choose to do so. The city listened cautiously. Officials were not immediately convinced by arguments about human psychology. They were, however, intrigued by the promise of social stability. A calmer population sounded appealing. A space that absorbed excess energy, noise, and agitation sounded useful. The park began to be discussed not only as a gift, but as a tool, a way to soften the edges of a rapidly changing society without confronting its deeper inequalities. In this sense, the dream was both sincere and incomplete. The park was imagined as a remedy, but one that addressed symptoms rather than causes. It offered relief without resolution, a pause button rather than a reset. For the dreamers, this was enough. They were not trying to solve everything. They were trying to give the city a moment to breathe. And perhaps that was their greatest naivety. Not the belief in nature, but the belief that the city would accept the park on its own terms, that it would remain a quiet, neutral space, untouched by power, profit, or conflict, that something built to calm society would not itself become a site of struggle. History, of course, is rarely that gentle. But at this moment, the dream was still intact. The idea of a park shimmered with possibility. It promised order without force, improvement without punishment, and calm without silence. It suggested that a city could care for its people not by controlling them more tightly, but by loosening its grip. Whether this was wisdom or wishful thinking remained to be seen. For now, the dreamers continued to speak, softly but persistently, convinced that somewhere in the middle of the island there could be a place where the city stepped back and allowed something else to take over. Not productivity, not ambition, just space, just time, just the quiet belief that people, given room, might become a little gentler. What these dreamers underestimated was not opposition, but complexity. They imagined the park as a neutral space, a kind of civic balm that would quietly absorb tension and return calm in exchange. They spoke of trees and meadows as if they were naturally peaceful, forgetting that peace is not a property of landscapes, but a condition negotiated by people. Still, their faith persisted. It was easier to believe in design than to confront the uncomfortable machinery of inequality, overcrowding, and power that drove the city forward. In their minds, the park was a classroom without walls. No lectures, no punishments, just example. People would see open lawns and instinctively slow down. They would walk winding paths and forget the straight lines of urgency that defined the rest of the city. Children would learn gentleness from ponds and patience from trees that did not hurry. Adults would rediscover silence without being instructed to do so. The park, they believed, would perform its work quietly, without credit, and without resistance. This belief carried a certain innocence. It assumed that people arrived in the park equally, that they would use it in similar ways, that the city's divisions would dissolve temporarily under shared shade. It imagined social harmony as something that could be encouraged through proximity rather than addressed through change. In this way, the dream was generous but incomplete, hopeful but strategically vague. New York officials found this vagueness useful. A park justified on moral and psychological grounds could be shaped according to political needs. It could be promoted as public good while remaining flexible in practice. The idea of calming society appealed to those uneasy with unrest, but uninterested in reform. Nature, after all, was far less demanding than policy. The dreamers spoke of European examples with increasing confidence. They pointed to cities that had learned how to integrate green space without sacrificing authority. They described parks not as retreats, but as organizing principles. A city with a park, they argued, understood itself better. It knew when to move and when to pause. This argument landed, not because it was entirely true, but because it was flattering. It suggested New York was on the verge of maturity, one bold decision away from joining a more refined lineage of cities. The city listened, nodding slowly. Pride, more than empathy, did much of the work. As discussions continued, the park transformed from an abstract hope into a tangible proposal. Measurements appeared, boundaries were sketched, budgets debated. The dreamers watched this process with cautious optimism, trusting that once the idea took physical form, its purpose would guide its future. They believed that intention, once set, would endure. This, too, was naive. Cities do not preserve intentions. They preserve structures. Once land is claimed and plans approved, control shifts quietly, often invisibly. What begins as a vision of calm becomes subject to negotiation, compromise, and reinterpretation. The dreamers would soon discover that building a park was not the same as protecting its meaning. But at this stage, the dream still felt intact. It hovered just ahead of reality, untested and therefore unspoiled. The idea that nature could soften society had not yet encountered the people it would displace, the labor it would require, or the power it would attract. It remained a concept, clean and uncomplicated, spoken of in measured tones and confident essays. The city, tired but curious, allowed itself to imagine the possibility. Not because it fully believed, but because it needed something to believe in that did not involve more work, more noise, or more urgency. The park offered an appealing contradiction, a massive project devoted to stillness. For a moment, that contradiction felt like progress, and so, quietly, without celebration, the dream moved closer to action. The belief that nature could correct what the city had intensified began to harden into plans that would reshape the island. The dreamers did not yet see the cost. They saw only the promise of relief, the hope that somewhere amid brick and iron there could be a place where the city stepped aside and allowed something gentler to take over. That hope would carry the project forward. Whether it would survive the journey was another matter entirely. Land that was never empty. When the city finally began to look for a place to build its great park, it did not search for emptiness, it searched for convenience. The distinction mattered, even if the language used at the time tried very hard to blur it. On maps and planning documents, the chosen area appeared irregular, rocky, inconvenient for development, and therefore expendable. It was described as marginal land, unsuitable land, land waiting for improvement. These words were tidy. They reduced complexity. They made decisions easier. On the ground, the land told a different story. There were houses there, modest but deliberate, built by people who intended to stay. There were paths worn into the soil by repetition rather than design, the kind that form when people walk the same way every day because that way leads home. Gardens appeared where the soil allowed it. Fences leaned slightly, not from neglect, but from years of being opened and closed without urgency. The land was uneven, yes, but it was known, familiar, shaped by use rather than ambition. This was not wilderness. It was not untouched. It was lived in. Communities had taken root quietly without asking the city for permission or recognition. Families settled where land was affordable and distance offered a measure of relief from the noise below. Life unfolded at a slower pace here, not because it was easier, but because it had room to do so. Children grew up recognizing faces rather than crowds. Neighbors knew one another by habit, not by schedule. The land held routines that did not translate well into statistics. But routines do not appear on maps. From above, The area looked disorganized. Streets did not align neatly. Structures did not follow a uniform plan. To planners accustomed to grids and straight lines, this irregularity signaled disorder. And disorder, in the language of progress, often becomes justification. As discussions advanced, descriptions began to shift subtly. What had once been referred to as settlements became clusters. Clusters became shanties. Shanties became nuisances. The vocabulary grew lighter as the implications grew heavier. It is easier to remove a nuisance than a neighborhood. Easier to relocate a cluster than a community. This transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, sentence by sentence, document by document. No single declaration erased the people living there. Instead, they were slowly edited out of relevance. Their presence acknowledged briefly, then minimized, then reframed as a problem to be solved. The land was not empty, but it was being emptied linguistically. Ownership existed, though it complicated the narrative. Deeds had been signed, taxes paid, improvements made. These details were inconvenient. They disrupted the image of unused land waiting patiently for civic improvement. So they were addressed quietly later through procedures and assessments that sounded neutral but carried irreversible weight. From the city's perspective, the park required continuity, a single, uninterrupted space. Communities introduced fragmentation. Homes created obstacles. Lives interfered with vision. In order for the park to feel natural, the existing human patterns had to be treated as temporary, accidental, or illegitimate. This is one of history's quieter techniques. You do not deny that people exist. You simply decide that their existence does not count enough to slow you down. Residents sensed the shift before it became official. Surveyors appeared. Measurements were taken. Men with papers walked the land, looking more at the ground than at the people standing on it. Conversations changed tone. Rumors circulated. The word park began to sound less abstract and more threatening. What unsettled people most was not the idea of change, but the absence of dialogue. Decisions seemed to arrive already formed. Questions were met with reassurance rather than answers. The future was described confidently, while the present was treated as something already passing. The city did not announce removal as removal. It framed it as improvement, progress, public good. These were difficult ideas to argue against, especially when wrapped in promises of beauty and benefit for millions. Individual lives weighed poorly against collective vision. The irony was sharp, though rarely acknowledged. A project intended to create calm began by unsettling those who lived closest to it. A space designed for rest required disruption. A park imagined as timeless demanded urgency from the people it displaced. From a distance, the process looked orderly. From within, it felt abrupt, confusing, and strangely impersonal. The land had not changed, but its meaning had. What was once home was now potential. What was once ordinary was now in the way. The city moved forward with polite determination. It did not rage, it did not celebrate, it simply proceeded. Paperwork advanced faster than conversations. Lines on maps grew firmer, words hardened into decisions. By the time the park began to feel inevitable, the people living on the land had already been reframed as part of the past. Their present was treated as temporary, even though it was the only one they had. History often smooths moments like this. It prefers clean transitions, but beneath the future lawns and trees, the ground remembered what had been there before. not as a monument, not as a warning, simply as layers of use, presence, and routine that did not vanish just because they were inconvenient. The land was never empty. It was made empty, first in language, then in fact. And once that process began, it was very difficult to stop. As the language shifted, so did the emotional weather of the place. What had once felt quietly stable began to feel provisional. People noticed how often officials returned, how measurements were repeated, how conversations grew shorter and less specific. Nothing had happened yet, and yet everything already felt different. The future had begun to arrive early, pressing against the present before it was invited. For the city, this was a familiar rhythm. Plans moved faster than people could adjust. Progress rarely waited for consensus. It advanced by assumption. The assumption here was simple. The land could serve a greater purpose. And when a purpose is described as greater, smaller lives tend to become negotiable. Residents were not consulted so much as informed. Notices appeared. Assessments followed. Numbers replaced stories. A house became a structure. A garden became an improvement. A neighborhood became a site. The transformation was bureaucratic, efficient, and remarkably calm. There were no dramatic confrontations at first, just an accumulation of small signals that suggested permanence was no longer guaranteed. The city's tone remained reassuring. Everything was legal, everything was orderly. Compensation would be provided. Timelines would be reasonable. These words carried weight, but not comfort. They explained procedure without addressing loss. They spoke fluently about value while remaining vague about what could not be measured. For those who lived there, the land was not an idea. It was a sequence of days, morning routines, familiar distances, sounds that meant home. None of this translated into official categories. None of it fit neatly into the vision of a continuous park. The park required unity. Life had created variation. In order to proceed, variation had to be flattened. This flattening did not require cruelty. It required patience. Time did much of the work. As decisions stretched on, uncertainty exhausted resistance. People waited. They adjusted plans. They delayed improvements. Why repair something you might soon lose? Why plant anything new? Slowly, inevitability settled in, heavier than any announcement. From the city's perspective, this was unfortunate but acceptable. Large projects always involve disruption. This was framed as temporary discomfort, in service of lasting benefit. The phrase, "for the public good," appeared often, carrying an authority that was difficult to challenge. After all, who could argue against millions benefiting from beauty and space? The difficulty lay in the fact that those millions were abstract. The people being displaced were not. History tends to describe moments like this in broad strokes. It speaks of development, acquisition, transformation. It rarely lingers on the in-between, the stretch of time when people still lived in houses, already marked for disappearance, when routines continued under the shadow of removal, when everyday life became strangely quiet, as if the land itself were waiting. The chosen site, once described as marginal, now carried enormous importance. Its value had been redefined. What it was no longer mattered as much as what it was going to become. The present was treated as an obstacle, something to be cleared, so the future could arrive unobstructed. This is how land stops belonging to those who live on it and begins belonging to an idea. The city did not celebrate this transition. It documented it. carefully, thoroughly, with forms, surveys, and polite language. The process was legal, procedural, and deeply impersonal. It allowed everyone involved to remain calm. Calm in this case was not peace. It was momentum without reflection. By the time removal became unavoidable, the story had already been rewritten. The land was no longer described in terms of community. It was described in terms of potential. The people who had lived there were now footnotes, if mentioned at all. Their presence acknowledged briefly, then absorbed into the background of progress. The park's future lawns and trees had not yet been planted, but their shadow had already fallen across existing lives. Change had begun not with force, but with words, with definitions that made displacement sound like improvement and erasure sound like order. The land, of course, remained what it had always been: uneven, familiar, quietly inhabited. But its fate had been decided elsewhere, in rooms far from the paths worn into its soil. And so, without ceremony, the land passed from lived space into planned space, from home into project, from present into past. The park had not yet been built, but it had already claimed its first cost. The land was never empty. It was redefined, and once redefined, it could be taken. That was how the city prepared the ground. A community quietly erased. What made the removal easier to justify was not force, but paperwork. The people living on the land were not trespassers. Many owned their homes legally. Deeds existed. Taxes had been paid. Improvements recorded. These were not temporary arrangements or accidental occupations. They were lives built carefully, piece by piece, in a city that rarely offered stability. And yet, legality turned out to be less powerful than momentum. Ownership in this context did not protect permanence. It merely complicated the process. The city acknowledged property rights formally and then proceeded around them. Compensation was calculated, notices delivered, procedures followed. Everything unfolded according to rules designed to make displacement feel orderly. The law was not broken. It was applied selectively with remarkable calm. For residents, this calm was unsettling. It suggested inevitability. There was no argument to win, only timelines to accept. Meetings explained outcomes rather than inviting discussion. Questions were answered with patience but little flexibility. The message was consistent. The decision had already been made. What remained was logistics. The phrase, "for the public good," did most of the work. It appeared in documents, speeches, and explanations carrying moral weight without specifying who defined that good or who paid for it. It framed removal as contribution rather than loss, a sacrifice made necessary by scale. Individuals were asked to step aside so millions might benefit from open space they would never fully control. The story, once simplified, traveled easily. A park was coming. The land had been acquired. Progress moved forward. Complexity faded. The fact that people had lived there became a footnote, mentioned briefly, if at all. Their presence was acknowledged only to emphasize how smoothly it had been resolved. From the city's perspective, this efficiency was reassuring. Large projects required decisiveness. Lingering over individual circumstances threatened delay. Delay threatened vision. Vision, once approved, demanded protection from distraction. And so the community was reduced to a transitional phase, something that existed briefly between nothing and improvement. its history compressed into a paragraph, its removal summarized in a sentence. What disappeared was not only housing but continuity. Relationships built over years dissolved quietly, neighbors scattered, familiar routines ended without ceremony. There were no monuments marking where kitchens once stood or where children had played. The ground would soon be reshaped, its previous uses buried beneath paths and lawns designed to feel timeless. History would later describe this as necessary, inevitable, even beneficial. These are comfortable words. They allow the past to sit neatly behind the present without asking uncomfortable questions. They frame erasure as transition and loss as progress. What history rarely records is the silence that follows removal, the absence left behind when a community vanishes without replacement, the pause before something new arrives. That quiet is temporary, but it is real. It lingers long enough to remind the land what has been taken. Once the community was gone, the story became easier to tell. There were no longer people to complicate the narrative. The land was now officially empty, ready, available. The park could proceed without interruption. This is one of history's preferred tricks. Remove the inconvenient, then forget it was ever there. Memory, like land, is shaped by those who decide what remains visible. The park would be celebrated for generations, its beauty admired, its calm praised. Visitors would walk across ground that had been carefully cleared of prior meaning. They would rest where others had once lived, without being asked to notice the transition. This forgetting was not accidental, it was useful. A clean story supported a clean space. The park's purpose was to soothe, not to unsettle. Remembering displacement would interfere with that function. And so the community faded into archives, reports, and occasional rediscovery. Its existence acknowledged later with curiosity rather than responsibility. The inconvenience of its memory softened by time. The city moved on, the park took shape. The story simplified itself. What remained was a lesson history repeats often and quietly, that legality does not guarantee permanence, that public good can be defined without public consent, and that forgetting is one of progress's most reliable tools. The community had not disappeared by accident. It had been carefully removed. And once removed, it was no longer necessary to remember. What followed removal was not chaos, but quiet, a particular kind of quiet that arrives after decisions have already been finalized and resistance has nowhere useful to go. Houses stood briefly empty, windows reflecting a future that had not yet arrived. Paths went unused. Familiar sounds thinned out, replaced by the soft administrative silence of land waiting to be repurposed. This was not destruction as spectacle. It was erasure by schedule, people left in stages not all at once. Some departed early, sensing inevitability and choosing control over timing. Others waited until the last possible moment, hoping the decision might soften or change its mind. It did not. The city had already moved on emotionally, even if the physical process lagged behind. Momentum favors the future, not those anchored in the present. For those forced to leave, there was no clear ending, no ceremony, no acknowledgement beyond receipts and signatures. Lives were dismantled efficiently, their value translated into numbers that traveled easily through offices but poorly through memory. What could not be quantified simply disappeared from consideration. The city did not ask what would replace the sense of belonging that had been removed. That question fell outside the scope of the project. Once the land was cleared, language shifted again. The past tense took over. The area had been settled. The community had existed. It had been resolved. Resolution is a powerful word. It suggests completion, satisfaction, closure. In practice, it often means only that attention has moved elsewhere. History prefers this version. It is tidy. It allows celebration without interruption. The park could now be discussed without qualifiers, without footnotes that slowed admiration. Beauty could stand on its own, unburdened by the complexity beneath it. What was lost did not vanish entirely. It lingered in subtle ways, in the way the land resisted certain changes, in soil disturbed more deeply than expected, in patterns that planners corrected without knowing why they felt wrong. Memory does not always announce itself. Sometimes it appears as inconvenience. But inconvenience, like memory, is something large projects are designed to overcome. As construction approached, the final traces of the community receded from view. The city did not look back. Looking back offers no utility. The narrative required forward motion, and forward motion requires simplification. The story was adjusted accordingly. The park would soon be framed as a triumph of foresight, generosity, and civic ambition. And in many ways, it was. But its earliest chapter remained unresolved, smoothed over by time and preference. The people who had lived there became historical background, their removal an unfortunate but necessary step towards something greater. This is how history becomes comfortable. It learns what to emphasize and what to soften. It remembers outcomes and forgets costs. It praises vision while quietly editing out disruption. The community did not fail. It was not chaotic. It did not collapse. It was simply made inconvenient to remember, and so it slipped from the center of the story to its margins where inconvenient truths often wait, waiting not to be restored but occasionally noticed when someone slows down enough to wonder what stood there before the grass arrived. With the land cleared and the past effectively settled, the city was ready to move on to design. The messy human chapter closed quietly, without resolution, without acknowledgement, and without pause. The park could now begin. The park as an idea. The park was never meant to be efficient. That was the first rule, though it was never written down. Efficiency belonged to the city outside the gates: straight streets, numbered blocks, predictable intersections, destinations announced in advance. The park was designed as a refusal of that logic. You were not meant to arrive quickly. You were not meant to move in straight lines. You were not meant to know exactly where you were going, and certainly not meant to worry about where you had been. This was not accidental. Every curve, every bend in the path, every gentle obstruction of sight was deliberate. The goal was not exercise. It was disorientation, mild and harmless, the kind that loosens the mind rather than alarms it. The park was designed to interrupt the city's habits, to teach the body a different rhythm without announcing that a lesson was taking place. Paths curved when straight lines would have been easier. Hills rose where flat ground had been available. Trees were placed not just to grow but to block views. Buildings were hidden, traffic lowered, noise softened. You were meant to forget slowly that you were standing on one of the most crowded islands in the world. The city was still there, of course, but it was asked to behave quietly. This was nature, but nature carefully edited, a version of the outdoors that felt spontaneous while being tightly controlled. Rocks were positioned to appear random. Water flowed where engineers had told it to. Meadows opened exactly when the eye needed relief. Forests thickened just enough to make the city feel distant, but never enough to feel unsafe. Wildness, but supervised. There is something gently ironic about this. A landscape engineered to feel unengineered. A natural experience built by people who distrusted nature to do the job on its own. But the irony was intentional, even necessary. Real wilderness would not have survived here. It was too unpredictable, too indifferent to comfort. This park was meant to soothe, not challenge. The design assumed something important about the people who would walk through it. That they were tired, even if they did not yet know it. That they needed rest more than stimulation. That given the right environment, they would slow down without being asked. The park did not command calm. It arranged conditions where calm became the easiest option. Even the views were choreographed. Long sight lines opened suddenly, offering a sense of space just as the mind began to tighten. Then they closed again, gently, pulling attention back inward. The city outside was noisy and demanding. The park answered with quiet complexity, an environment that asked nothing but presence. In this way, the park functioned less like a destination and more like a state of mind. You entered it not to arrive somewhere, but to leave something behind. Street numbers, schedules, edges, urgency. The park did not promise transformation. It promised pause. And perhaps that was the most radical part. In a city built on motion, the park was designed as an argument for stopping. Not completely, just enough to notice your breathing again. The nature was convincing because it did not try too hard. It avoided spectacle, no dramatic peaks, no overwhelming vistas. Just enough variation to keep the senses engaged without demanding interpretation. The park did not ask you to admire it, it simply allowed itself to be there. This was not nature as wilderness. It was nature as refuge, carefully constructed, quietly persuasive, and surprisingly effective. People walked differently here, slower, softer, as if the ground itself had asked them to. The city outside continued to grow louder, faster, taller. Inside the park, time behaved differently. Minutes stretched, thoughts wandered. The mind loosened its grip on usefulness. That was the design working as intended. A park not as a place, but as a condition. Not as escape, but as interruption. Not as nature restored, but as nature reimagined, just believable enough to let the city rest. And for a while, it worked. And yet, beneath this calm choreography, there was discipline. The park asked its visitors to behave without ever saying so. Certain movements felt natural, others subtly discouraged. Running too fast seemed out of place. Shouting felt awkward. Even arguments softened here, as if raised voices were absorbed by leaves before they could finish forming. The design did not enforce rules. It created atmosphere, and atmosphere did the rest. Benches appeared exactly where fatigue might arrive. Paths widened where crowds would naturally gather, then narrowed again to disperse them gently, like a thought that had grown too loud and was reminded to settle. Water was placed where sound needed cushioning. Trees thickened where the city insisted on announcing itself too clearly. Every element negotiated with the urban world outside, not through confrontation, but through quiet redirection. This was not accidental beauty. It was behavioral architecture, a space designed to teach without instruction, to calm without authority, to convince the body that slowing down was not a failure, but a perfectly reasonable response to the environment. In this way, the park functioned as a soft correction to the city's excesses, not a solution, just a pause. The idea of wandering became central, getting lost briefly, safely, without consequence. The city outside punished disorientation. Here it was encouraged. If you forgot which direction you were heading, nothing terrible happened. In fact, something pleasant often followed. A clearing, a view, a moment where the mind stopped organizing and simply observed. Even the artificiality of it all faded with time. Visitors did not think about where the soil came from or how many hands shaped the ground beneath their feet. They experienced only the effect: shade, space, quiet. The illusion was complete enough to feel real, and that was sufficient. People rarely demand authenticity when comfort is convincing. There is a certain kindness in this design, though it carries a trace of control. The park trusted people to rest, but only within parameters carefully arranged for them. Freedom, yes, but guided. Nature, yes, but curated. A wilderness that would never surprise too sharply or demand too much. A place where even getting lost had boundaries. Perhaps this was necessary. True wildness would have clashed with the city's nerves. It would have asked questions the city was not prepared to answer. The park offered something gentler, a version of nature that cooperated, one that allowed people to believe, for an hour or two, that the city had not fully claimed them. As years passed, the design became invisible. Success tends to do that. When something works well enough, people stop noticing it. The curves felt inevitable. The views felt accidental. The calm felt natural. The fact that none of it was accidental faded into the background. What remained was experience, the slow walk, the softened thoughts, the sense that the city had loosened its grip just slightly. That was the park's true achievement. Not grandeur, not scale, but subtlety. The ability to change how a person felt without asking them to think about why. In a world growing louder and faster by the year, the park stood quietly, offering a different tempo. It did not argue with the city. It simply waited, confident that people would eventually wander in, tired enough to listen. And they did. They still do. The idea held. The design endured. The illusion of nature, carefully built and patiently maintained, continued to do its quiet work. Not fixing the city, not redeeming it, just giving it somewhere to rest briefly before returning to its habits. That was the concept made real. A park not as decoration, but as interruption. Not as escape, but as relief. And for the moment, that was enough. Labor without names. The park did not rise quietly, even though it would later become a place devoted to quiet. Its creation was loud, physical, and exhausting in ways that are difficult to preserve once the noise has passed. Long before the paths softened footsteps and trees learned how to hold shade, the land answered every touch with resistance. Rock refused to move politely. Swamps did not drain themselves. Soil was not generous. None of it wanted to become a park. So people were brought in. Tens of thousands of them. Mostly young, mostly poor, mostly recent arrivals to the city, carrying accents, fatigue, and expectations that had already been lowered by experience. They were not invited to imagine the finished park. That was not their role. Their task was simpler and heavier. Move what does not wish to move. They dug, they broke stone, they filled low ground that swallowed tools and boots with equal enthusiasm. They hauled earth by hand, by cart, by repetition. Day after day, season after season, They reshaped the island inch by inch. This was not creative labor in the romantic sense. It was corrective labor, the work of forcing land into agreement. Rock had to be blasted because it refused persuasion. Holes were drilled by hand, powder packed carefully, fuses lit. Explosions echoed across the city, reminding everyone that calm is something constructed, not discovered. Afterward, rubble was cleared by people whose names were never written down, replaced as needed by others, equally anonymous. The city kept track of progress, not of individuals. Swamps were drained not because they were unhealthy, but because they were inconvenient. Water was redirected, earth was layered, mud was persuaded to become ground that could support trees. This required patience and bodies willing to be tired without recognition. The work did not ask for belief in the project. It required endurance. Then came the planting. Hundreds of thousands of trees and shrubs brought in from elsewhere, one root system at a time, each hole dug, each trunk steadied, each sapling given just enough support to survive the illusion of natural growth. The labor here was quieter, but no less demanding. Knees sank into soil, hands blistered, backs bent into familiar shapes. None of this labor left signatures. There are no plaques listing the men who lifted the stones or stood ankle-deep in water until the land agreed to change. There are no statues of those who planted trees that would outlive them. The park remembers the work, but not the workers. It remembers results. Shade, paths, stillness. This absence was not an oversight, it was part of the design. To remember the labor too clearly would have disrupted the illusion. The park was meant to feel effortless, as if it had always been there, waiting. Acknowledging the cost in sweat and injury would have made the calm feel conditional. So the work was allowed to disappear behind the result. The workers moved on when their part was finished. Some to other construction sites, some to other cities, some nowhere in particular. Their lives continued with the same uncertainty they had brought with them. The park did not follow them. It stayed, rooted, increasingly admired, increasingly detached from the process that made it possible. Over time, the ground smoothed. Grass learned how to cover scars. Trees grew tall enough to hide the memory of effort. Visitors walked the paths without sensing the weight once carried there. The park did not correct them. It accepted their footsteps quietly. This is how large projects prefer to be remembered. Not as accumulation of labor, but as outcome. Not as exhaustion, but as atmosphere. The park offers rest generously without reminding anyone how much rest it consumed before it could offer any. And perhaps that is fitting. The laborers did not ask for memory, they asked for work. They completed it. The park exists because they did and continues because their absence makes it easier to enjoy. The city calls this progress. History calls it necessary. The park calls it nothing at all. It simply remains, letting grass grow where effort once lived, inviting people to sit without asking them to consider who made sitting possible in the first place. And so the work fades, quietly, into the ground it shaped. As the years passed, the work disappeared so thoroughly that even its absence stopped being noticeable. The city grew accustomed to the idea that the park had simply arrived one day, fully formed, like a good decision remembered, without the argument that preceded it. People strolled beneath trees, without wondering who had stood there first, holding a sapling upright, while the wind tested its patience. Children ran across grass that had once been mud deep enough to swallow carts. The land kept its secrets well. The workers did not leave behind stories that traveled far. Their names were not convenient to record. Many were new to the city, some new to the country, most new to the idea that their labor might ever be remembered. They worked, they were paid, and then they moved on, carrying sore muscles and ordinary lives forward into other ordinary demands. The park did not follow them. It stayed where it was, becoming something cleaner, calmer, and far more admired than the hands that shaped it. In this way, the park perfected a familiar exchange. Effort was traded for invisibility, labor for atmosphere. The more successful the result, the easier it became to forget what it took to achieve it. Grass covered memory efficiently. Trees absorbed attention upward, away from the ground where work had once been concentrated. Visitors felt relief here. That was the point. Relief does not ask questions. It does not investigate origins. It accepts the present gratefully and moves on. The park learned this lesson well. It offered comfort without explanation, and people responded by trusting it. Nothing in the design demanded acknowledgement. There were no interruptions reminding visitors that calm had been constructed, not discovered. The illusion depended on forgetting, and forgetting came easily once the work was done. Time smoothed everything else. Occasionally, a thought might surface, brief and unfocused. Someone might wonder how such a place came to be or how long it took. The question rarely lingered. The bench was comfortable. The shade was convincing. The moment passed. The workers became part of the foundation in the only way history often allows, not through names but through absence, through the fact that something exists smoothly enough to make its creation seem unnecessary to remember. And so the park rests on quiet layers of effort, invisible and uncelebrated, doing what it was designed to do, offering rest to those who arrive tired, without asking them to consider how tired others once were, so that this rest could exist at all. The labor is finished, the names are gone, the work remains, and the park, as always, stays silent about how it came to be, letting the ground hold what memory does not. When politics arrived late. Politics did not help imagine the park. It did not clear the land. It did not lift stone or plant trees. Politics arrived later at the precise moment when the park began to matter. This timing was not accidental. Power has a reliable instinct for value, and value announces itself once something is finished, admired, and impossible to move somewhere else. At first, the park was an idea. Ideas are inconvenient for politics. They are uncertain, expensive, and difficult to control. Then the park became land-shaped into promise. Still risky, still unfinished. Only when the paths settled, the trees took root, and the public began to care, did the attention shift. That was when authority leaned in, curious and alert. A successful park is a tempting thing. It sits in the open, gathers people without charging admission, and quietly increases the worth of everything around it. That kind of influence does not go unnoticed for long. Where people gather, decisions follow. Where decisions follow, budgets appear. And where budgets appear, politics feels at home. The language changed subtly. The park was no longer just a place to rest. It became an asset, a responsibility, a line item. Maintenance needed contracts. Repairs required approvals, improvements invited proposals. None of this was inherently corrupt. It was simply the next stage of ownership, the moment when ideals begin to share space with opportunity. Nature remained beautiful. The grass did not object. The trees continued to grow, but behind the scenes, the calm exterior masked a quieter competition. Who would manage what? Who would supply materials? Who would benefit from keeping things exactly as they were, and who might profit from changing them slightly? Politics does not disrupt spaces abruptly. It adjusts them incrementally, just enough to leave fingerprints without causing alarm. The park had been designed to soften human behavior, but it had not been designed to resist governance. No landscape can. Authority does not need to shout to assert itself. It prefers paperwork, meetings, committees, the slow layering of influence that feels administrative rather than forceful. Visitors noticed little at first. A new structure here, a widened path there, a maintenance decision explained as practical necessity, everything reasonable, everything justified. The park still worked, it still calmed. That was enough for most people, but gradually the balance shifted. The space designed to interrupt the city began to reflect it. The same negotiations that shaped streets and buildings now shaped greenery. Efficiency crept in quietly. Cost-saving decisions altered texture. Visibility began to matter more than experience. Nature was still present, but increasingly required to justify itself. The irony was gentle but persistent. The park existed to counter the pressures of the city, yet it could not fully escape them. It had value now, and value attracts attention that rarely arrives empty-handed. What had been created as a refuge became inevitably a resource. Still, the park endured. It absorbed these changes the way it absorbed footsteps. Without complaint, without acknowledgement, people continued to rest beneath trees, unaware of how many discussions had taken place to allow that rest to continue. The calm remained convincing, even as decisions multiplied beneath it. Politics did not ruin the park. That would have been too obvious. It reshaped it slowly, carefully, often invisibly. The ideal softened. The vision adjusted. The original intent blurred just enough to remain recognizable while becoming manageable. Nature remained beautiful. Budgets remained persuasive, and the park learned how to exist between them, not untouched, not defeated, just changed in the quiet way that power prefers. And so the park continued, still offering relief, even as it carried the weight of interests that arrived only once the hard work was done. As authority settled in, it learned the park's rhythms and adjusted itself accordingly. There was no single moment where ideals were replaced by interests. That would have been too visible. Instead, small decisions accumulated. Maintenance schedules aligned with convenience. Contracts favored familiarity. Improvements were justified by necessity rather than intention. The park still looked like a park, which was enough to quiet most concerns. This is how power prefers to operate inside beautiful things. It does not remove them. It repurposes them gently. A path widened here to accommodate traffic. A structure added there to support use. Each change reasonable on its own. Together they altered the experience just enough to feel different without feeling wrong. The public rarely noticed. They came for relief, not analysis. As long as the grass was green and the benches remained, the park fulfilled its promise. Few visitors paused to consider why certain areas felt more polished than others, or why some improvements appeared quickly while others waited indefinitely. The park did not explain itself. It did not need to. Behind the scenes, influence continued to layer. Meetings produced minutes. Minutes produced budgets. Budgets produced outcomes. None of this disturbed the birds or the trees. Nature is remarkably tolerant of bureaucracy as long as it is allowed to continue growing. And so it did. The original vision was still there, but it had learned how to coexist with compromise. The park no longer existed solely to interrupt the city. It had become part of the city's machinery, still offering calm, but now required to justify its calm in economic terms. Value was no longer measured only in rest or relief, but in proximity, desirability, and return. This did not destroy the park, it complicated it. The space carried both intentions at once, the desire to soothe and the impulse to manage. Visitors felt the first. Administrators worked within the second. Both believed they were preserving something important. The park adapted quietly. It always had. From land reshaped by labor, to refuge shaped by design, and now to asset shaped by governance. Each phase layered over the previous one without fully erasing it. History rarely replaces. It prefers to stack. And so politics settled in not as an intruder, but as a late arrival who stayed. It adjusted the rules, refined the edges, and learned to speak softly enough not to disturb the atmosphere. The park remained peaceful even as it became useful in ways never written into its original promise. Nature continued to do its part. People continued to arrive tired. And power continued to notice what had become valuable. The park stood between them, holding all three without comment, doing what it had always done best, absorbing pressure quietly and letting the appearance of calm carry on. A park is never finished. The park was declared complete more than once. Papers were signed, reports were filed, speeches were given with a tone that suggested closure. Completion is a comforting word. It implies that something has been settled, that effort can now step aside and allow admiration to take over. The park accepted these declarations politely, and then continued behaving as if they had never happened. Living spaces do not understand the idea of finished. They respond only to attention. When care is present, they hold their shape. When it drifts away, they loosen, quietly at first, then more visibly. Grass thins, paths crack, trees grow unevenly, not dramatically, just enough to suggest neglect rather than collapse. The park never rebelled. It simply responded. This surprised people. The assumption had been that a good idea, once built, would take care of itself. That beauty, having proven its value, would naturally persist. But the park did not share this optimism. It required constant, patient work. Water needed direction. Soil needed replenishment. Trees needed pruning not to control them, but to keep them alive in an environment that constantly tested their endurance. When care slowed, the park changed quickly. It did not wait. Nature does not pause out of respect for budgets or intentions. Without maintenance, paths softened into mud. Without guidance, water returned to places it had once been persuaded to leave. The city noticed only when the effects became inconvenient. Then attention returned, briefly. Repairs were made, grass replanted, benches replaced. The cycle repeated. Care followed by neglect, followed by concern, followed by care again. The park learned this rhythm early. It adapted by becoming resilient, not perfect. What faded most easily was not grass or stone, but purpose. Without steady attention, the original intent blurred, decisions made for convenience accumulated, quick fixes replaced thoughtful ones. The park still functioned, but its quiet intelligence dulled slightly. It became reactive rather than deliberate. This was not failure. It was reality. Ideas do not defend themselves. They rely on people who remember why they mattered in the first place. When that memory weakens, the idea survives only in form, not in spirit. The park endured because enough people noticed when it began to slip. Not all at once, not consistently, but enough to prevent complete erosion. Concern arrived late, as it often does, but it arrived before the damage became irreversible. There was something instructive in this. The park, designed to slow people down, revealed how quickly neglect accelerates decay. It showed that calm requires effort, not once, but continuously. That rest must be maintained. That relief is not permanent. And so the park remained unfinished, not because it was flawed, but because it was alive. Each generation adjusted it slightly, repaired what the previous one had overlooked, and introduced new compromises that the next would eventually question. Completion turned out to be the wrong goal. Continuation mattered more. The park did not ask to be perfected. It asked to be noticed repeatedly, to be cared for without ceremony, to be protected not by declarations but by routine attention. When that attention wavered, the park reminded the city quietly through weeds, cracks, and tired trees. In this way, the park remained honest. It never pretended to be self-sustaining. It made no promises about permanence. It offered rest, but only if rest was returned to it in the form of care. The idea survived, but only because people kept choosing it again and again. Not dramatically, not heroically, just often enough. A park is never finished. It is only maintained or neglected. And the difference between the two appears faster than most people expect. Over time, the park developed a quiet reputation for honesty. It did not hide the consequences of inattention. When funding thinned, when priorities drifted, when care was postponed in favor of more urgent matters elsewhere in the city, the park responded without drama. Lawns thinned, paint peeled, paths lost their definition. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to remind everyone that living systems do not wait patiently for human schedules to align. This made the park uncomfortable in a useful way. It refused the fantasy of permanence. Unlike monuments of stone or steel, it could not pretend to be finished and then endure untouched. It required return visits not just from walkers, but from caretakers, from people willing to do small, repetitive tasks that rarely attract attention: watering, trimming, repairing what had worn down quietly rather than spectacularly. Whenever the park declined, explanations followed: economic downturns, shifting priorities, temporary constraints, all reasonable. The park accepted them and continued to age accordingly. It did not argue, it simply mirrored the level of care it received. When attention returned, recovery followed. Slowly, unevenly, always with traces of what had been lost in the interim. This cycle became part of the park's character. Periods of neglect, followed by renewal, not as failure, but as evidence that the park existed inside human systems, not above them. It was subject to the same forgetfulness, the same bursts of concern, the same delayed responses that governed everything else in the city. And yet, each time care returned, something remarkable happened. The park responded generously, grass thickened again, trees recovered, paths regained their shape. It never held grudges. It did not require apology. It simply resumed its work, offering rest and quiet as soon as conditions allowed. This generosity made the lesson easy to miss. Because recovery was possible, neglect felt less dangerous than it truly was. People learned the wrong conclusion, that the park would always bounce back, no matter how long it was ignored. But recovery was not guaranteed. It was earned each time through renewed effort. In this way, the park taught something subtle about ideas themselves. A good idea does not survive on its own. It survives through repetition, through people choosing it again, even after forgetting it briefly, even after allowing it to fray. The park was never meant to stand untouched. It was meant to be held in place through ongoing care, through attention that is steady rather than dramatic, through maintenance that rarely feels rewarding but always proves necessary. When people say the park is finished, what they usually mean is that they have stopped looking closely. The park does not correct them. It waits. It always waits, because it knows something the city often forgets. That calm is not a state you achieve once. It is a condition you maintain or lose gradually. And so the park remains unfinished by design, not incomplete, but alive, changing with each season, each generation, each shift in attention, asking quietly for care and offering quiet in return when it is given. That is the agreement it has always kept. No promises of permanence, only the possibility of rest, renewed again and again, as long as someone remembers to tend the ground beneath it. A shared space, imperfect by design. The park was never fair in the mathematical sense. It did not distribute comfort evenly, nor did it correct the inequalities of the city surrounding it. Some entrances were easier to reach than others. Some paths were better maintained. Some corners felt welcoming, while others quietly reminded visitors that not all attention is spread equally. The park made no claim to justice. That was not its assignment. And yet, something unusual happened within its boundaries. For brief stretches of time, difference softened. Not erased, not solved, but blurred just enough to become less sharp. People arrived from different directions carrying different weights. Some came with leisure. Some came with exhaustion. Some came because there was nowhere else to sit without being asked to justify their presence. Inside the park, those distinctions lost some of their urgency. Not all of it, just enough. The grass did not ask who deserved it. Benches did not request proof of purpose. Paths accepted footsteps without preference. This was not equality, it was proximity. That proximity mattered. It allowed people who would never otherwise share space to exist alongside one another without instruction. Not interacting necessarily, not understanding, simply occupying the same ground without conflict. In a city that specialized in separation, this alone felt notable. The park did not pretend that everyone experienced it the same way. Some people stayed longer, some felt safer, some noticed details others overlooked. But everyone could sit, everyone could pause, everyone could be still without being immediately questioned. That small permission carried weight. There is something quietly radical about a place that allows idleness without explanation. In most of the city, presence must be justified. You are there to work, to buy, to pass through. In the park, sitting was allowed to be the reason. That was enough. This did not solve inequality. It did not dissolve tension, but it offered a temporary truce, a shared interval where the city's usual hierarchies loosened their grip. People sat near one another without negotiating status. Children played without needing credentials. Older bodies rested without apology. The park did not enforce this. It merely created conditions where it could happen. The rest followed naturally, or at least quietly. People learned the rhythm without instruction. Lower voices, slower movement, less urgency to assert ownership over space. Even conflict softened here. It did not disappear, but it changed shape. Arguments lost volume, disagreements shortened. The environment discouraged escalation simply by refusing to support it. Trees do not amplify. Grass absorbs sound. Water interrupts focus. The result was not harmony, but coexistence, a state far rarer and more fragile. The park did not require people to like one another. It only asked that they share the same air without turning it into a problem. This sharing was imperfect and uneven, but it was real. For some, the park was a destination. For others, a refuge. For many, just a place to pass time until something else demanded attention. All of these uses were accepted without hierarchy. That acceptance was the park's quiet offering. Not fairness, not equality, just access. The ability to exist briefly without being pushed along. In a city built on momentum, the park allowed stillness. In a place obsessed with progress, it permitted pause. That permission mattered more than symmetry ever could. People left when they were ready, or when they had to. The park did not insist. It did not keep records. It did not ask what they took with them, perhaps only a softened edge, a slightly slower breath, a moment where the city did not feel quite as heavy. That was the shared space at work, not perfect, not neutral, but open enough to matter. And maybe that was always the point. Not to create fairness, but to create room. Not to resolve difference, but to hold it without collapse. At least for a while. At least long enough to sit down. What the park offered, in the end, was not fairness but suspension, a pause in the constant sorting that the city performs without noticing it is doing so. Inside the park, people were briefly released from roles. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to feel the difference. A factory worker and a banker could sit on the same bench without acknowledging the imbalance that waited for them beyond the trees. The park did not correct that imbalance. It simply delayed its relevance. This delay was powerful precisely because it was temporary. The park never promised escape. It promised interruption. You could step out of the city's pressure for an hour, perhaps two, and then return slightly rearranged. Not transformed, just quieter. The kind of quiet that makes survival feel less sharp. There were limits, of course. Certain behaviors were welcomed more than others. Certain bodies felt more at ease. The park reflected the city's inequalities, even as it softened them. It could not erase fear entirely. It could not guarantee safety equally. But it did something subtler. It reduced friction just enough for coexistence to feel possible. People learned how to share space here without needing instruction. They watched each other indirectly without confrontation. They adjusted their pace. They negotiated distance silently. The park encouraged this through design rather than rules. Curved paths reduced collision. Open lawns absorbed crowds. Trees created privacy without isolation. This quiet negotiation mattered. It showed that common space does not require agreement, only tolerance, only the willingness to remain present without insisting on control. The park trained this behavior gently through repetition until it felt natural. Over time, this shared use became ordinary, so ordinary that it stopped being remarkable. Children played where strangers sat. Couples passed without comment. Individuals rested near others they would never speak to. The park did not ask them to connect. It asked them to coexist. That coexistence was fragile but real. It existed because the park allowed it to, because it provided enough space for difference without forcing interaction, because it did not demand explanation for rest. In a city that often asks people to justify their presence, this mattered more than elegance or scale, the ability to sit without purpose, to pause without reason, to be unproductive in public without consequence. The park held this space without claiming credit. It did not advertise its role. It simply remained available, quietly absorbing the city's contradictions without resolving them. And perhaps that was the most honest outcome. A shared space that did not pretend to fix inequality, but refused to worsen it. A place that allowed people to exist side by side without insisting they become the same. Not perfect, not fair, but open. Open enough to matter. And sometimes that is the rarest condition a city can offer. When a city learned how to pause. Central Park did not solve the city. It never claimed that it could. No park ever has. Cities do not become fair because grass exists, and people do not become gentler simply because trees are nearby. The park did not erase inequality, did not untangle history, did not return what had already been taken, or restore what had already been lost. Those expectations belong to a different kind of story, one history rarely delivers. What the park did was quieter and far less dramatic. It created a pause, not a solution, not an answer, just a space where the city could briefly stop talking to itself. For a city that had spent decades shouting in every direction at once, this mattered more than it seemed. New York had grown loud before it learned how to listen. It had expanded faster than its ability to reflect. Streets filled, buildings rose, people arrived with urgency in their bodies and nowhere to place it gently. The city learned how to move long before it learned how to rest. Central Park did not correct that imbalance. It interrupted it. Inside its boundaries, the city softened. Not entirely, not permanently, but enough to notice. The noise dropped just slightly. Movement slowed just enough to feel intentional rather than reactive. For a brief stretch of time, the city's constant demand for productivity loosened its grip. This was not reform. It was relief. The park did not ask visitors to become better people. It did not lecture them about harmony or progress. It simply provided conditions where intensity faded on its own, where urgency lost momentum, where standing still did not require explanation. That alone was radical. In most cities, especially industrial ones, stillness is treated as inefficiency. Pausing is suspicious. Sitting without purpose invites questions. But in the park, idleness was permitted. You could sit without buying. You could linger without producing. You could remain without justification. The city allowed this not because it had resolved its contradictions, but because it needed a pressure valve, a place where the systems driving it forward could briefly release tension without collapsing. The park became that release. It absorbed excess energy quietly. Anger cooled faster here. Fatigue settled. Thoughts stretched out instead of piling on top of one another. None of this fixed the world outside the gates. but it made returning to that world feel survivable. There is a tendency to overstate what spaces like this accomplish, to frame them as moral achievements or as proof of collective enlightenment. But the park's real contribution was humbler. It offered silence and then got out of the way. Silence in this context did not mean absence of sound. It meant absence of demand, the absence of being pulled in multiple directions at once, the absence of constant evaluation, the absence of having to explain why you were there. This silence did not change people. It allowed them to stop changing for a moment. History often celebrates moments of action. Revolutions, reforms, laws passed, systems overturned. Those moments are easier to name, easier to narrate. Silence rarely receives credit. It does not announce itself. It does not leave monuments behind. But sometimes silence is the condition that makes endurance possible. The park offered that condition. It did not rewrite the city's past. It did not balance its inequalities. It did not protect everyone equally or distribute comfort evenly. Some people felt safer than others. Some felt more welcome. Some had easier access. The park reflected the city's imperfections because it existed within them. But it also created something rare. Shared pause. People who would never otherwise share space did so here without negotiation. They did not have to agree. They did not have to interact. They only had to coexist. For a city built on separation, this was no small thing. The park did not promise unity. It offered proximity. That proximity mattered. It softened edges. It made difference less threatening. Not erased, just less sharp. In the park, people learned how to occupy space together without asserting dominance over it. They learned how to be present without performing. This learning did not happen consciously. It happened through repetition, through walking the same paths, sitting on the same benches, hearing the same water. Over time, behavior adjusted, voices lowered, movements slowed, attention turned inward. The park trained the city in subtle ways. It trained it to wait. This waiting was not passive. It was restorative. The kind of waiting that allows thought to settle instead of collide. The kind that allows exhaustion to surface rather than be suppressed. The kind that makes survival feel less aggressive. The city needed this more than it needed another solution. Central Park did not teach the city how to be fair. It taught it how to breathe. Breathing like silence rarely appears in historical accounts as progress. It is assumed rather than acknowledged, but without it nothing else holds for long. Systems collapse, people fracture, tension accumulates until it finds expression in destructive ways. The park reduced that pressure slightly and consistently, day after day, year after year, not through policy but through presence. This is easy to overlook because the park feels ordinary now, familiar, expected. Its success made it invisible. When something works quietly for long enough, it stops being recognized as work at all. But the quiet is doing something. It continues to absorb the city's noise. It continues to slow bodies that arrive moving too fast. It continues to offer rest without conditions. It continues to hold space without asking for credit. In a world that increasingly values speed, output, and visibility, this kind of function is difficult to defend. Silence does not justify itself well. It does not generate metrics. It does not scale easily, and yet it remains essential. The park survives because people continue to need it, even if they do not always articulate why. They arrive tired. They leave slightly less so. That is enough. Central Park does not improve humanity. It does not correct injustice. It does not resolve conflict. Expecting it to would misunderstand its purpose entirely. What it does is simpler and more durable. It allows the city to stop speaking for a moment. It allows history to pause without demanding explanation. It allows people to sit without being moved along. In that pause, something subtle happens. The city becomes less brittle, less reactive, slightly more capable of continuing without tearing itself apart. This is not redemption. It is maintenance. And perhaps that is the most honest form of progress history ever achieves. Not the promise of perfection, but the provision of silence. Not the correction of all wrongs, but the prevention of collapse. Not transformation, but endurance. Central Park remains not because it solved the city, but because it gave the city something it did not know how to give itself. A moment to stop, a place to rest, a quiet interval where nothing needed to be fixed immediately. And sometimes that pause is enough to keep everything else from breaking. That is what the park offered. That is what it still offers. A city, briefly, learning how to be quiet. And now as this story settles, there is nothing left to resolve. The park remains where it has always been, not waiting for agreement, not asking to be understood. It does not need conclusions. It does not require applause. It simply continues, doing the small, quiet work it was built to do, holding space, absorbing noise, allowing the city to slow without announcing that anything special is happening. Somewhere beyond the trees, the city is still moving. Streets are still busy. Lights are still on. Decisions are still being made at a pace that rarely allows rest. But here, at least for this moment, none of that needs your attention. The story does not demand that you remember every detail. It does not expect judgment. It does not even require agreement. It only asks that you notice the pause. That pause is not empty. It is full of softened sound, of distance from urgency, of the quiet permission to stop engaging for a while. It is the same pause the city learned, imperfectly, to allow itself all those years ago. A pause that did not fix everything, but made continuing possible. If your thoughts have slowed, that is enough. If your breathing has softened, that is enough. If the edges of the day feel slightly less sharp, that is enough. History does not always move forward by changing things. Sometimes it moves forward by letting things rest, by learning when to stop adding noise, by allowing silence to do the work that argument cannot. Central Park still holds that lesson quietly, without insisting anyone learn it. And tonight, you do not need to carry it with you. You can leave it there, among the trees and paths and open space, doing what it does best, waiting patiently for whoever needs it next. For now, you can rest. Thank you for staying here, for listening, for allowing the story to unfold without rushing it. Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, I hope the quiet travels with you a little longer. Good night, sleep well, and we'll meet again gently in the next story.